Margaret Holloway had always believed that family, even when imperfect, was permanent. At 72, she carried herself with the quiet grace of someone who had survived both love and loss. A widow for 12 years, she had built her life around one simple principle. If you have the means to ease the burdens of the people you love, you do it without keeping score. That belief led her to the gates of Silver Creek Vineyard on a bright September afternoon. The venue was breathtaking. Rows of white chairs faced a wooden arch draped in soft ivory fabric and wildflowers. Rolling hills stretched behind it, painted gold by early autumn sunlight. Strings of glass lanterns hung above long banquet tables set with polished silverware and crystal flutes. Soft piano music floated through the warm air. It was her granddaughter Olivia's wedding day. Margaret stepped out of the car slowly, smoothing the emerald shawl around her shoulders. She wore a tailored cream suit she had saved for something meaningful. On her wrist rested a thin gold bracelet that had belonged to her late husband, Edward. He used to tell her that elegance wasn't about clothes, it was about composure. She felt composed, hopeful even. The driver helped her to the entrance path lined with white roses. Guests laughed nearby, champagne glasses clinked, cameras flashed. Several people recognized her. Mrs. Holloway, the wedding is stunning. It's all so beautifully done. She smiled politely. Thank you. Olivia deserves something special. And she meant it. For nearly 8 months, Margaret had quietly financed every detail of this celebration. The vineyard deposit, the catering from a renowned chef, the live string quartet, the custom floral installations flown in from Oregon. Even the hand-engraved invitations had passed through her hands before being mailed. When Olivia and her parents, Margaret's son Richard and his wife Denise, had come to her living room one winter evening with hesitant smiles and careful voices, she had known what they wanted before they asked. "Mom," Richard had begun gently, "weddings today are complicated." Denise had added, "We just want Olivia to have something unforgettable." Margaret had looked at her granddaughter's hopeful face and felt the same instinct she had felt her entire life. She would make it happen. By the time the final contracts were signed, the total had climbed to nearly $120,000. More than she originally intended. Far more than she admitted out loud. But she never complained. What she didn't notice, or chose not to, was how the conversations shifted over time. At first, they asked her opinion. Later, they informed her of decisions. Eventually, they contacted her only when another invoice was due. Margaret told herself they were stressed. Weddings were emotional. People acted differently under pressure. She ignored how Denise corrected her in front of vendors. She ignored how Richard began speaking to her in clipped, impatient tones whenever she hesitated before approving another expense. She ignored the way Olivia stopped calling her just to talk. Still, she stood at the vineyard that afternoon believing that whatever tension had existed would dissolve once the ceremony began. Family, she believed, always returned to itself. She walked toward the welcome table at the entrance where guests were being directed to their seats. Richard stood there in a navy suit, greeting people with rehearsed enthusiasm. Denise hovered beside him, scanning the crowd with alert eyes. For a brief moment, Margaret felt warmth. This was her family. She stepped forward. Richard saw her. His smile faltered. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just enough. "Mom," he said, stepping slightly into her path. She leaned in to kiss his cheek. He did not move. Denise suddenly became absorbed in rearranging escort cards. "I'm so proud of Olivia," Margaret said softly. "Everything looks beautiful." Richard glanced at the clipboard in his hand, then at her. There was something in his eyes she had never seen before. Calculation. "Mom, can I speak with you for a second?" The music continued behind them. Guests drifted past. The sky remained perfectly blue. Margaret felt a small ripple of unease. Of course. He lowered his voice, but not enough. There seems to be a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? She repeated lightly. He flipped through the printed guest list clipped to his board. Page after page. Slowly. Deliberately. Then he stopped. Looked up. You're not assigned a seat. The words didn't make sense at first. I'm sorry. Richard swallowed. The venue has strict capacity limits. We had to make final adjustments. Margaret stared at him. Denise still did not look up. You're saying, Margaret's voice remained calm, almost curious, that I don't have a place at my granddaughter's wedding? Richard exhaled sharply. It's just numbers, Mom. We had to prioritize. Prioritize. The piano music sounded distant now. Margaret's heartbeat filled her ears. I financed this wedding, she said quietly, not accusing, simply stating a fact. Richard's jaw tightened. That doesn't mean you control it. There it was. Not confusion. Not an oversight. A decision. Around them, a few nearby guests pretended not to listen. Margaret felt every eye, every whisper. She could make a scene. She could demand answers. She could remind them, loudly, whose name appeared on every contract. Instead, something inside her went very still, like glass freezing over. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted the gold bracelet on her wrist. I see, she said. Richard looked relieved that she wasn't shouting. Denise finally glanced at her, briefly, with an expression that almost resembled annoyance. Margaret nodded once. I hope the day is everything Olivia wanted. Then she turned. The walk back down the rose-lined path felt longer than when she had arrived. Guests stepped aside politely. No one spoke to her. The vineyard gates stood open behind her, sunlight pouring through as if nothing had shifted. The driver hurried to open the car door. Everything all right, ma'am? Margaret paused before answering. Yes, she said evenly. I simply realized I'm no longer needed. The car pulled away. Through the window, she could see the white arch growing smaller in the distance. Her reflection stared back at her, dignified, composed, unbroken. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. By the time she reached her townhouse overlooking Lake Ashton, the sun had begun to sink behind the water. The house greeted her with silence. She walked inside slowly, removed her heels, placed her purse on the console table. In the hallway hung a framed photograph of Edward. He stood beside her in front of their first home, sleeves rolled up, smiling like the world could never surprise him. Margaret touched the edge of the frame. You would have seen this coming, she whispered. Maybe he would have. Maybe he wouldn't. She changed out of her wedding clothes carefully, folding them with precision. Not out of habit, out of control. Then she walked into the small study at the back of the house. The room still smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. A metal filing cabinet sat beneath the window. She unlocked it. Inside was a thick folder labeled, Olivia, Wedding. She placed it on the desk and opened it. Contracts. Receipts. Wire confirmations. Vendor agreements. Each one clearly naming the client. Margaret Holloway. She sat down slowly. For the first time that day, her lips curved, not in joy, not in anger, in understanding. They had removed her presence. But they had forgotten something important. Paper does not forget. And neither did she. She reached for her phone and scrolled to a contact she hadn't called in years. Jonathan Pierce. Her late husband's attorney. The man who had guided her through estate transfers, business negotiations, property acquisitions. The line rang once. Margaret, this is a surprise. Her voice was steady. I need to review some documents tomorrow morning. A pause. Is something wrong? She looked down at the stack of papers in front of her. No, she replied calmly. Something is finally clear. She ended the call and leaned back in her chair. Outside, the lake reflected the last orange light of day. At the vineyard, glasses were probably clinking, music swelling, photographs capturing smiles. But Margaret Holloway was no longer thinking about the ceremony. She was thinking about ownership, about legal standing, about silence as strategy. They believed they had excluded her. What they didn't yet understand was that exclusion only works when the person being excluded has nothing left to hold. Margaret had everything, and she was finished asking to be included. The morning after the wedding, Margaret Holloway did not wake up grieving. She woke up precise. Sunlight filtered through the pale curtains of her bedroom, touching the wooden floor in long, quiet stripes. For a moment she lay still, listening to the soft hum of the city beyond Lake Ashton. No messages. No missed calls.
No apologies.
She expected none. Instead of lingering in bed replaying the humiliation at the vineyard, she rose at 6:30, made her coffee the way Edward used to, strong, no sugar, and carried it into her study. The folder labeled Olivia. Wedding lay exactly where she had left it, waiting. At 9 o'clock sharp, she stepped into the downtown office of Jonathan Pierce. The building smelled faintly of polished wood and old books. Jonathan was older now, his hair silver at the temples, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He didn't waste time with small talk. "Tell me everything."
She did.
Calmly, factually.
No embellishment. No tears.
Jonathan listened without interruption, flipping through the contracts she laid before him. His brows lifted slightly as he reviewed the venue agreement. "Client of record, Margaret Holloway," he read aloud. He moved to the catering contract. "Financial guarantor, Margaret Holloway." The floral designer, the musicians, the event insurance policy. Each document led back to her. Jonathan leaned back in his chair slowly. "They excluded you from an event you legally hosted." Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "That seems to be the case. And the property transfers we arranged 5 years ago, the townhouse they're living in, that's still under your holding company." "Yes." "And the SUV Richard drives?" "Registered to me. Insurance as well." Jonathan's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Margaret, this is remarkably clear." She nodded once. "Clarity is helpful." He studied her carefully. "What do you want?" That question lingered in the room longer than she expected.
What did she want?
Not revenge. Revenge was loud, messy, emotional. What she wanted was balance. "I want to correct a misunderstanding," she said finally. Jonathan's expression sharpened. "Go on." "They believe generosity equals obligation. I want to remind them it does not." He folded his hands on the desk. "Then we proceed carefully.
Legally.
Without theatrics." That's exactly what I had in mind. By the time she left his office, 3 actions were already set in motion. First, the monthly automatic transfer to Richard's account, the one that had quietly covered their mortgage supplements, utilities, and unexpected expenses, was terminated immediately. Second, a formal notice of property review would be delivered to the townhouse within 72 hours.
No aggression.
Simply documentation of ownership and updated occupancy terms. Third, the vehicle registration would be flagged for reassessment under asset protection protocols. Paperwork. Nothing more. Nothing less. While Jonathan handled the legal framework, Margaret drove herself home. For the first time in years, she noticed how light the steering wheel felt beneath her hands. She stopped at a small salon near the lake, a place she had passed dozens of times but never entered. Inside, the air smelled of citrus and fresh shampoo. "I'd like something different," she told the stylist. "How different?" Margaret studied her reflection in the mirror. The soft waves she had worn for decades suddenly felt like part of a story that no longer fit.
"Shorter," she said.
Cleaner. An hour later, silver strands framed her face with sharp elegance. She barely recognized herself, but she liked the woman looking back. Over the next few days, she made additional appointments. A financial technology workshop at the community center, a cybersecurity seminar for seniors, a consultation with her investment advisor to restructure liquid assets into accounts accessible only through biometric verification. For years, Richard and Denise had insisted online banking was too complicated for her. It wasn't. It had simply been convenient for them to believe so. On the 5th day after the wedding, her phone finally rang. Richard. She let it ring twice before answering. "Mom," he began, attempting a casual tone. "Just checking in." She imagined him pacing their kitchen, the granite countertops she had paid for gleaming under designer lights. "I'm well," she replied evenly. There was a pause. "Listen, the transfer didn't go through this week. The bank said there was no error." "That's correct." Silence stretched. "You stopped it?" he asked carefully. "Yes." Another silence, thicker this time. "Why?" Margaret looked out her study window at the still water of the lake. "Because I chose to." His voice tightened. "Mom, that's not funny." "I'm not joking." Denise's voice rose faintly in the background. "Ask her if something's wrong with her account." Richard lowered his tone. "Is this about the wedding?" Margaret allowed herself one slow breath. "You looked at me and told me I didn't have a seat. It was capacity issues. We explained that." "You explained nothing," she said calmly. "You decided." Richard's frustration sharpened. "We were under pressure. You're overreacting."
No, Margaret replied.
"I am responding." Another pause. "You can't just withdraw support like this," he said. "We rely on it." "There's the misunderstanding," she answered softly. "You believe it was yours." Denise grabbed the phone. "Margaret, this isn't the time to be emotional. We have responsibilities." Margaret's voice remained steady. "So do I." Denise scoffed. "You don't have expenses like we do." Margaret almost smiled. "You're right," she said. "I have ownership." The word landed heavily. Richard took the phone back. "What does that mean?" "It means," Margaret said, her tone level as glass, "that the townhouse you live in remains under my holding company. The vehicle you drive is registered to me. And every financial contribution I've made was voluntary." The line went completely silent. "That's ridiculous," Richard finally snapped. "You wouldn't actually. I already have." Denise's breath caught audibly. "What did you do?" she demanded. "I reviewed my assets. With counsel." "You went to a lawyer?" Richard's voice rose in disbelief. "Yes." "You're being irrational." Margaret leaned back in her chair, entirely composed. "Yesterday," she said evenly, "I completed a full medical and cognitive evaluation with a licensed specialist. The results confirm I am of sound mind and judgment. A copy has been placed on file with my attorney." Silence. Absolute silence. The implication hung heavy between them. If they intended to challenge her capacity, she had already anticipated it. Richard spoke more quietly now. "Mom, we can talk about this when we come over." "That won't be necessary." "Are you punishing us?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "No," she said at last. "I am correcting myself." She ended the call before either of them could respond. For the first time since the vineyard, she felt something unfamiliar. Relief. Not because they were suffering, but because the illusion had ended. Over the next week, legal notices were delivered.
Polite. Precise.
Impossible to ignore. Occupancy terms would be reevaluated. Vehicle usage required compliance documentation.
No accusations.
No raised voices. Just paper. Paper had a voice, and it spoke clearly. Margaret did not call anyone to explain herself. She did not defend her actions to relatives or neighbors. When a distant cousin texted asking about family tension, she responded with a single line: "Everything is being handled appropriately." She spent her evenings reviewing investment portfolios, learning encryption protocols, attending workshops. In a room full of women her age, she found quiet solidarity. Stories of adult children who mistook kindness for entitlement, of mothers who confused sacrifice with love. Margaret listened. She did not feel bitter. She felt awake. On the 10th day, Richard called again.
His tone had changed.
"Mom, we received something in the mail. I expected you would. It says 30 days. Yes. You're serious? Yes. Denise's voice trembled faintly in the background. We have nowhere else to go. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, not in hesitation, but in memory, of the vineyard gates, of being told she had no place. You had somewhere, she said quietly. You chose not to include me there. Richard exhaled shakily. Please, he said. Let's fix this. Margaret stared at the lake outside her window. You already fixed it, she replied softly.
And she meant it.
The correction was underway. Not fueled by anger, not driven by humiliation, but by something far more enduring: self-respect. She placed the phone face down on her desk and returned to reviewing the final pages of the wedding contracts. They had removed her from a seat. What they didn't realize was that she still held the table. The notice was delivered on a Thursday afternoon.
No dramática enfrentación.
No raised voices. Just a sealed envelope placed neatly into the brass mailbox beside the townhouse door Richard and Denise had called their own for 5 years. It wasn't their house. It never had been. Margaret did not drive by to watch. She did not sit in her car waiting for a reaction. Instead, she attended her Thursday technology workshop at the community center. That day's lesson was about digital asset protection and multi-factor authentication. While Richard stood in his kitchen staring at legal language printed in calm black ink, Margaret was learning how to secure her investment portfolio behind biometric verification. 2 separate worlds. One built on assumption, the other on preparation. Richard called that evening. She didn't answer immediately. She was slicing vegetables for dinner, moving with slow intention. When the phone vibrated a second time, she dried her hands and picked up. What is this? He demanded without greeting. It's documentation, she replied. It's an eviction notice. It's a change in occupancy terms. His breathing was heavy. You're forcing your own son out of his home. My home, Margaret corrected gently. Denise's voice broke through, sharper, panicked. This is insane. We have 30 days. 30. Yes. You're humiliating us. Margaret paused at that word. Humiliating. She remembered standing beneath the vineyard arch, guests staring as she was quietly erased. I am following the law, she said calmly. Nothing more. Richard's anger flared. You're doing this because of a misunderstanding at the wedding. No, she answered evenly. I am doing this because of a pattern. Silence. He didn't know how to argue with that. After the call ended, Margaret returned to her dinner. She ate slowly, without appetite but without tension. The air in her home felt clear, almost crisp. Over the next week, the reactions unfolded predictably. First came bargaining. Richard appeared at her apartment building on Monday evening. Margaret saw him through the security camera near the entrance. He looked tired, less polished than usual. His confidence had thinned. She did not buzz him in. Instead, she answered through the intercom. Mom, we need to talk face to face. This is not the place for that. You're overreacting. We can work something out. There's nothing to work out, she replied. The terms are written. Denise's voice rose in the background. Tell her she's destroying the family. Margaret almost smiled at the irony. Family, she said softly into the speaker, requires mutual respect. Richard's voice cracked slightly. You're punishing us.
No.
I am adjusting. He stayed outside another 5 minutes before finally walking away. Margaret returned to her reading chair by the window and opened her book. Second came anger. 2 days later, Richard called again, this time furious. You can't do this legally. We'll fight it. You're welcome to seek counsel, she replied calmly. You think a lawyer makes you powerful? No, she said. Preparation does. You're acting like we exploited you. Margaret allowed herself one measured breath. You did. The word landed heavier than she expected. Richard faltered. That's not fair. Fairness, she said quietly, would have been a chair at the wedding. Silence again. He had no response. Third came fear. On day 17, Denise called alone. Her voice was unsteady, stripped of sharpness. Margaret, please. We don't have savings like you do. The mortgage rates right now are impossible. Olivia just started her graduate program. We're trying. Margaret listened without interrupting. I supported you for years, she said gently. Without complaint. We never forced you. You never refused. Denise began to cry softly. Margaret felt something twist in her chest. Not regret, but grief. Grief for the illusion she once carried. Grief for how easily generosity had become expectation. I am not leaving you homeless, she said calmly. You have 30 days. That is lawful notice. You are capable adults. Denise's voice hardened slightly. So that's it? After everything? Margaret looked around her apartment, quiet, orderly, free. Yes, she said. That's it. When the call ended, she did not feel victorious. She felt steady. Meanwhile, she moved forward. She met with a real estate agent to list the townhouse. The market was strong. Interest was immediate. Within 10 days, 3 competitive offers arrived. Margaret selected the cleanest contract, not the highest. She valued certainty over spectacle. She also reviewed the SUV's title transfer. The vehicle would be returned to her at the end of the occupancy period. If they failed to comply, insurance would lapse automatically.
No arguments.
Just systems. During this time, something unexpected happened. She began sleeping deeply. Not the restless half-sleep she had grown accustomed to over the years, waiting for the next emergency call requesting funds. Not the anxious sleep of someone worried about disappointing her son, but full, uninterrupted rest. The silence in her home no longer felt empty. It felt earned. On day 29, Richard called one final time. His voice was no longer angry. It was tired. We're packing. I see, she replied. I never thought you'd actually go through with this.
Margaret considered that.
I never thought you'd exclude me from your daughter's wedding, she said gently. He didn't argue. I kept thinking you'd change your mind. I did, she said softly. That's why we're here. There was a long pause. Do you even care what happens to us? The question was not accusatory. It was genuine. Margaret answered honestly. I care very much. That's why I'm doing this. He didn't understand. Perhaps he never would. On the 30th day, an envelope arrived by courier. Inside were 2 house keys and the SUV key fob. No note.
No apology.
Just metal resting against paper. Margaret held the keys in her palm for a long moment. They were warm from the courier's hand. She expected to feel triumph. Instead, she felt release. That evening, she walked through the empty townhouse alone before the sale finalized. The rooms echoed slightly now.
Spar.
Closets cleared. She stood in the kitchen where she had once watched Olivia decorate cookies at Christmas. Where Richard had toasted promotions. Where Denise had hosted dinner parties proudly describing their home. Margaret touched the marble countertop lightly. I gave you everything, she murmured to the empty room. Except consequence. Now they had that too. She turned off the lights and locked the door. The next morning, she met with her financial advisor to reallocate proceeds from the sale into a diversified investment strategy Edward had once sketched out on a napkin years ago. She also booked something unexpected, a 3-week coastal trip in the spring. Alone. Not to escape, but to explore. On the drive home, her phone buzzed. Olivia. Margaret hesitated before answering. Grandma? The voice was smaller than she remembered. Yes, darling. I didn't know everything that was happening, Olivia said quietly. I thought Mom and Dad were handling it. Margaret listened. They said it was complicated, that you were upset about small things. Margaret smiled faintly. It wasn't small. I know that now, Olivia whispered. There was strain in her voice, not financial, but emotional. Marriage is harder than the wedding, Olivia admitted softly. Margaret did not ask for details. I hope you learned the right lessons, she said gently. I'm sorry you weren't there, Olivia added. Margaret looked out at the horizon where the lake met the sky. I was exactly where I needed to be. After the call ended, she felt no bitterness toward her granddaughter. Only clarity. Family was not erased in a single moment, but respect could be. And once lost, it required rebuilding, not assumption. That night, Margaret sat by her window as dusk settled over Lake Ashton. The air was still. Her phone remained silent. For the first time in decades, her finances, her property, her decisions, all of it, answered to no one but her. She had not raised her voice. She had not fought in public. She had not demanded apologies. She had simply removed what was never appreciated. And in doing so, she discovered something powerful. Consequences do not need to be loud. They only need to be real. She closed the curtains gently and turned off the lights. The house exhaled around her, and Margaret Holloway, no longer mistaken for a resource, slept without carrying anyone else's weight. 3 months after the keys were returned, Margaret Holloway no longer measured time by silence. Silence had stopped feeling like absence. It had become space. The townhouse had sold quickly. The proceeds had been distributed into carefully structured investments, municipal bonds, dividend portfolios, and a long-postponed charitable fund in Edward's name. She handled every signature herself, every transfer authenticated by her own devices.
No intermediaries.
No explanations required. The SUV now sat in her own garage. She rarely drove it. She kept it because she could. But the most noticeable change wasn't financial. It was internal. Her mornings were no longer interrupted by subtle anxiety, the anticipation of a message asking for money, a crisis that required her immediate assistance. She woke when she wanted.
She read.
She walked along the lake. She attended her workshops. She joined a discussion circle for women over 60 who had quietly carried entire families for decades. There, she discovered something unsettling and comforting at the same time. Her story was not unique. Different names, different cities, the same pattern. Mothers who had confused sacrifice with love. Children who had confused generosity with entitlement. Margaret did not speak often in the group. When she did, her voice was steady. There is a difference, she said one afternoon, between helping someone stand and carrying them so long they forget how. The other women nodded. Some wiped away tears. Margaret no longer felt anger when she thought about Richard. What she felt instead was distance, the kind that grows when illusion dissolves. Richard had not called again after the final key exchange. Denise hadn't either. The silence from their side was louder than any argument. Margaret accepted it. One crisp October afternoon, her phone rang with a number she recognized immediately. Olivia. Margaret answered. Grandma. The word carried weight this time. Yes, sweetheart. There was a hesitation.
A breath.
I wanted to see you. In person. Margaret considered the request. Not cautiously.
Thoughtfully.
You're welcome here. Olivia arrived the following Sunday. She looked thinner. Not fragile, just aware in a way she hadn't been before. They sat by the window overlooking the lake. Tea steamed gently between them. For a while, they spoke of ordinary things. Graduate school, the changing weather, the coastal town Margaret planned to visit in spring. Then Olivia's composure slipped. I didn't understand, she admitted. I thought weddings were just stressful. I thought you were upset about small details. Margaret did not rush to respond. It wasn't about flowers, she said quietly. I know that now. Olivia looked down at her hands. Things aren't what I thought they would be. Margaret heard the unspoken truth in her voice. Marriage had not fixed anything. The celebration had not erased cracks. When money holds things together, Margaret said gently, it doesn't strengthen them. It just delays the break. Olivia's eyes filled. Are you angry at me? Margaret studied her granddaughter carefully. No, she said honestly. I was disappointed, but not in you. In Mom and Dad? In myself, Margaret corrected softly. Olivia frowned. I allowed a pattern to continue because it felt easier than confronting it.
They sat with that.
After a moment, Olivia whispered, they're struggling. Margaret nodded. Struggle teaches. Do you regret what you did? Margaret looked out at the lake, sunlight rippling across the water. No, she said after a long pause. I regret that it took me so long. Olivia reached across the table and took her hand. I'm sorry you stood alone that day. Margaret squeezed her fingers gently. I wasn't alone, she said. I had myself. That answer lingered between them longer than any apology could have. After Olivia left, Margaret walked slowly through her apartment. The air felt balanced. Not heavy with conflict. Not buzzing with guilt. Balanced. A week later, she received a letter from Richard. Not a text. Not a voicemail. A letter. The handwriting was familiar, but less confident than she remembered. He did not apologize directly. He wrote about misunderstandings, about stress, about changing circumstances. He mentioned the difficulty of downsizing, the shock of financial independence, the discomfort of explaining to friends why they had moved. At the end, one sentence stood apart. I suppose I never learned what you were trying to teach. Margaret read that line twice. Then she folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer. She did not respond, not because she was cold, but because not every realization requires commentary. In the months that followed, her life expanded in quiet ways. She took the coastal trip alone. She walked along cliffs overlooking restless gray water. She booked a small sailing lesson on impulse. She ate dinner at a seaside restaurant without checking her phone once. One evening, as she watched the sun sink into the horizon, she realized something unexpected. She did not miss being needed. She missed being valued. There was a difference. Back home, the charitable fund in Edward's name began supporting local scholarships for students studying financial literacy. Margaret attended the first award ceremony quietly, sitting in the back row. When one of the recipients stood at the podium and thanked the anonymous donor who believes independence is a gift, Margaret felt a warmth that had nothing to do with obligation. That was giving. Not because she was expected to,
but because she chose to.
Winter arrived slowly. Lake Ashton froze at the edges. Margaret decorated her apartment modestly for the holidays. A small tree, white lights, simple ornaments. She received a short message from Olivia on Christmas morning. Thank you for teaching me what respect looks like. Margaret smiled at that. There were no invitations from Richard or Denise. She didn't expect them. On New Year's Eve, She stood by her window as fireworks reflected over the lake. The city hummed softly in celebration. She thought about the vineyard, the arch, the list, the moment she was told she had no place. At the time, it had felt like erasure. Now she saw it differently. It had been a revelation. If she had been seated that day, smiling politely in the second row, nothing would have changed. The pattern would have continued. The transfers would have flowed. The entitlement would have deepened. Being excluded had forced her to see what inclusion had hidden. She did not lose her family. She lost the illusion that sacrifice guaranteed respect. And in losing that illusion, she gained autonomy. As midnight approached, she poured herself a small glass of champagne. To clarity, she murmured. Not to revenge. Not to vindication. To clarity. Her phone buzzed just before midnight. A simple message from Richard. Happy New Year, Mom. No request. No demand. Just that. Margaret looked at the words carefully. Then she replied, Happy New Year, Richard. Nothing more. It was not reconciliation. It was boundary. And that, she had learned, was far more durable than obligation. When the fireworks faded and the city quieted, Margaret turned off the lights and prepared for bed. The house did not feel empty. It felt owned. She was 72 years old. She was not powerless. She was not invisible. She was not a wallet. She was a woman who had mistaken endurance for love and corrected herself before it was too late. And as she lay down that night, she understood something fully for the first time. The real beginning of her life had not happened at the vineyard gates. It had happened the moment she stopped asking for a seat at someone else's table and built her own.